everyone, Hollie here with Becker School Supplies. Now, the Science Center is my favorite part of the early childhood classroom, but I know that sometimes it can be challenging to keep that space engaging all year long. So Becker's has put together a fantastic Science Center kit filled with tools and objects and other great things to really reinvigorate your Science Center. Now, I want to share with you some of the ways that I like to use those tools and objects to really extend the learning beyond the Science Center. Are you ready? Let's get started. Oftentimes as students get older, we ask them to classify things on one specific detail. So by color or by shape or by size, and that's really important. But also deciding how to classify something is just as important. And putting that sort of power in the hands of your young learners can be really telling about their scientific process. So I gave my young scientist here a bunch of shells, and I asked her to sort of put them in groups. So first she was mostly focused on sort of the size and the shapes. She had her nice big flat one, she had a pointy one, then she had sort of these rounded ones. Now as she was going along, she did change her classification. Like those two shells that were stacked, those were put together because they were the same color. Now, as we introduce different shells, she's going to think about, well, now all of these things that I put together, where should I put this new shell? So this new shell here, right away, she saw that it was sort of the same size and shape as this one. And then as I added more, she started looking more closely at the details. That's important. As long as your young learner is able to tell you sort of why they've put the different objects together, it's a valuable learning experience. Okay, so if they're able to tell you these are together because of the same color, these are together because of the same size, this one's by itself because I don't know where it goes. It does cause them to look a little bit more closely, as you can see here. She's now noticed that lots of the shells have spirals, but now she's trying to figure out how does she designate those sort of spiral shells one from another. So shells are fantastic for sorting and classifying, but sometimes it's challenging to bring the objects, the shells in your Science Center, and the animals that made those shells, called mollusks, together. The connection's not always there. So I want to share with you an activity that sort of bridges that gap and introduces students to the animals that make the shells in their Science Center. So to introduce this new idea of mollusks building their shells layer by layer, we start with a concept that your students are probably very familiar with, that animals need to protect themselves. They need to stay safe. So we start with our soft, squishy mollusk, which is that beanbag there. And as you can see, the very first thing she did was squish it. So our mollusk needs to build something to keep itself nice and safe. And in this case, it's a shell. So we start with our bottom layer, but as you can see, our mollusk is still able to be squished. So they're going to have to build a top layer. So now we sort of push down on our mollusk and it's sort of nice and safe, but we're going to build layer by layer until we have a nice strong shell that will keep our mollusk safe. So if we look inside, there's our soft squishy animal. That's the animal that's building this shell. And now we can look back at the shells we were observing before, and we can make a greater connection between those things that they were making observations with and exploring and the live animals that created them. So most mollusks will make their shells that way, layer by layer by layer, until they have a nice strong shell to keep them safe. But you probably noticed in your Science Center that not all shells look the same, and not all of them are sort of flat like the one we made in our activity here. There are really two types of shells that you're going to see most often in your Science Center. That doesn't mean that these are the only types of shells, but these are the two main ones that your students will probably be sorting while they're looking through the shells. So let's take a closer look. So this one here is very similar to the one we made in our activity. It's nice and flat and it's got that scalloped edge. This comes from an animal called a bivalve, and it's easy to remember because bi means two. So it's the types of shells that have a top and a bottom and usually are hinged. Now the soft squishy mollusk that lives inside is sandwiched between those two shells. Now they come in lots of different shapes and sizes. Some are symmetrical like our first one, and some are not. Some have that beautiful sort of shiny underside and some do not. You'll also see shells like this in your collection. Now these are not bivalves because there's only one single shell. And so these are called univalves. Now you might also see them called gastropods or snails. They're sea snails, and they make these beautiful spiral shells. Now they're made very similarly to our bivalve, layer by layer by layer, but as they're building it in a different part of their body, so we get that nice little spiral instead. Well, I hope everything I shared with you today makes your your science center the most exciting place in your classroom. Now, if you're looking for the shells or any of the really cool tools we talked about today, make sure you go to shopbecker.com and you'll see our science center kit there. It's filled with all great things to really reinvigorate your science center. Thank you for joining me today with Science Center tips for Becker School Supply.